They watched you enter buildings and they knew immediately whether you were protected, not by your clothes, not by your words, but by one spiritual act done before you crossed the doorway. An ex-Satanist has now revealed the terrifying truth they never wanted Christians to discover. Because there are places darkness cannot follow you once you enter covered. The ex-Satanist leaned forward during the interview and said something that silenced the entire room. We feared certain Christians before. They even opened their mouths. Not pastors, not famous people, not those who carried giant Bibles for attention, but believers who understood spiritual entry. Because according to him, darkness studies entrances. Doorways matter in the spirit. Thresholds matter. Moments of transition matter. And one of the most vulnerable moments in your entire day is the moment you step into a new environment. Your home, your workplace, a hospital, a school, a government office, a store, a courtroom, room. The ex-Satanist said many attacks were assigned at entrances because most people enter places unconsciously, distracted, emotionally open, spiritually uncovered. And that is exactly when spiritual surveillance begins. He explained that occult groups believed certain locations carried spiritual atmospheres already prepared for manipulation. Places full of confusion, anger, addiction, lust, fear, oppression. And when believers entered carelessly, they absorbed what was already operating there. But then he revealed something chilling. There were Christians we could not influence once they performed one act before entering. One act, simple, quiet, invisible to people, but violent in the spirit. He said these believers would pause before entering a building, not for long, sometimes only seconds. But in those seconds, they acknowledged God's authority over the territory they were entering. And according to him, that changed everything. Because darkness depends on unguarded access. The enemy wants emotional doors open, mental doors open, spiritual doors open, but when a believer intentionally submits their entrance to God, spiritual permission shifts. Suddenly the atmosphere changes. The ex-Satanist described it this way. It felt like hitting invisible resistance. Imagine that. Demons assigned to stir confusion in a workplace suddenly unable to provoke you. Spirits assigned to create intimidation suddenly unable to weaken your confidence. Oppression waiting. Inside the room suddenly losing access to your mind. Not because you shouted, but because you entered spiritually aware. Most Christians underestimate awareness. They think spiritual warfare only happens during dramatic moments. But many battles are won or lost before conversations even begin, before meetings start, before arguments happen, before temptations appear. The ex-Satanist said occult practitioners specifically watch for spiritually careless believers because careless entrances reveal careless covering. And he said something terrifying. We could often tell who prayed before entering and who did not. That revelation shook many people, because you may think the spirit world ignores your daily habits. It does not. He explained that when believers entered certain places prayerless, anxious, angry, or emotionally unstable, they became easier targets for spiritual pressure, not possession. Pressure to compromise, pressure to fear, pressure to explode in anger, pressure to feel drained, pressure to lose peace. Have you ever entered a building feeling completely normal, then suddenly your mind became heavy, suddenly irritated, suddenly fearful, suddenly distracted? The ex-Satanists claim many believers never discern that environments can carry spiritual weight. And if you enter without awareness, you absorb atmospheres you were supposed to confront. That is why spiritually mature believers do not enter spaces casually. They pray first, even briefly. Lord, cover me. Holy Spirit, guide me. I submit this place to your authority. Protect my mind and spirit. Let no darkness influence me. Simple prayers. But according to the testimony, those prayers created spiritual barriers occult practitioners hated. Why? Because intentional surrender activates spiritual authority. The ex-Satanists describe believers who walked into hostile environments carrying unusual calm. Meetings designed to humiliate them failed. Manipulation failed. And occult workers became frustrated because their influence could not penetrate believers who entered spiritually covered. Then he revealed another secret. Certain Christians changed the atmosphere simply by entering. That statement disturbed even former occult members listening to him. Because darkness expects agreement. If you enter fearful, darkness amplifies fear. If you enter angry, darkness amplifies anger. If you enter insecure, darkness amplifies insecurity. But when you enter submitted to God, peace begins pushing back chaos. And this explains why some believers survive environments that destroy others. Same building, same pressure, same people, but different spiritual preparation. One enters emotionally exposed, another enters spiritually armed. The difference becomes visible over time. The ex-Satanist then shared a story he claimed he would never forget. A Christian woman worked in a deeply occult-influenced office environment. Constant gossip, manipulation, jealousy, division. Many employees broke emotionally within months. But this woman remained steady, not loud, not dramatic, steady. Every morning before entering the building, she paused at the entrance and prayed quietly. The ex-Satanist said occult practitioners assigned against her became frustrated because emotional traps repeatedly failed. Arguments would begin around her but never consume her. Temptations would emerge but never attach to her. Fear campaigns failed to weaken her. Eventually, one occult worker reportedly said, "She enters with someone protecting her." That statement carries weight, because the spirit realm recognizes authority many Christians ignore. The problem is not that believers have no authority. The problem is many walk unaware of it. You were never meant to wander through hostile atmospheres uncovered. You were never meant to enter places disconnected from God's presence. The ex-Satanist warned that modern distraction has weakened spiritual alertness. People rush constantly, phones buzzing, thoughts scattered, emotions unstable. And darkness loves spiritual distraction because distracted believers stop discerning. They stop praying before entering environments. They stop guarding their minds. They stop recognizing spiritual pressure. Then they wonder why peace disappears. But the testimony reveals something powerful. A few seconds of intentional surrender before entering a place can interrupt spiritual interference. Not superstition. Submission, that is the key. The power was never in a ritual. The power was in acknowledging divine authority before stepping into environments where darkness expected vulnerability. And according to the ex-Satanist, occult systems feared believers who practiced this consistently, not occasionally, consistently, because repeated spiritual awareness builds spiritual discipline, and disciplined believers become difficult to manipulate. He ended the first revelation with words that stunned the audience. "We preferred Christians who entered blindly." That sentence should wake you up, because every day you cross thresholds, into conversations, into meetings, into environments, into atmospheres. And every entrance becomes an opportunity for either spiritual vulnerability or spiritual authority. The question is no longer whether darkness studies entrances. The question is whether you will keep entering places unaware. The ex-Satanist lowered his voice before revealing the next secret. And when he spoke, the room became completely silent. Some buildings were spiritually marked long before Christians entered them. That statement carried fear behind it, because he was not only talking about obvious occult locations. He claimed some offices were spiritually poisoned by corruption, some homes by violence, some businesses by greed, some schools by darkness, some entertainment spaces by addiction and immorality. And many believers walked into these environments, completely unaware. No prayer, no discernment, no spiritual preparation. Just open exposure. The ex-Satanist said occult practitioners believed entrances created legal opportunities for spiritual influence when people entered emotionally and spiritually uncovered. And according to him, darkness preferred believers who mocked spiritual awareness. Why? Because careless believers rarely guarded their atmosphere. They consumed everything, absorbed everything, reacted to everything. Their peace kept disappearing. The ex-Satanist explained that one of the greatest spiritual weapons believers possess is intentional consciousness of God's presence before entering hostile environments. Not panic, not superstition, awareness. That changes how you enter places. You stop entering casually. You stop entering emotionally naked. You stop walking blindly into atmospheres designed to drain you. Instead, you begin entering with authority, focus, and spiritual alignment. Then he revealed something terrifying. We sometimes assign pressure to entrances themselves. That sentence disturbed even former occult members. Because according to the testimony, moments before entering important places often became battlegrounds. Sudden anxiety before walking into work. Sudden confusion before entering a meeting. Sudden heaviness before entering church. Sudden anger before entering your own home. Have you ever noticed that? You were calm minutes earlier. Then suddenly pressure appeared, for no clear reason. The ex-Satanist claimed many believers ignored these moments instead of discerning them. And because they ignored them, they entered environments already emotionally compromised. That is exactly what darkness wanted. Because once pressure enters your emotions, it begins shaping your reactions. And reactions matter in spiritual warfare. One angry response can damage relationships. One fearful decision can alter direction. One compromised moment can create consequences for years. That is why spiritually alert believers pause before entering spaces to regain alignment. The ex-Satanists describe Christians who would quietly pray before opening doors, not dramatic prayers. Simple prayers filled with authority. Lord, let your presence go before me. Guard my mind. Let no darkness attach itself to me. Give me discernment. Cover this atmosphere. He said occult practitioners hated believers who did this consistently because intentional prayer interrupted spiritual pressure before it could fully establish itself. Then he shared another disturbing revelation. There were places where we expected Christians to live weaker. Think about that. Certain environments were designed spiritually to exhaust believers, to drain joy, drain focus, drain purity, drain confidence. And many people never realized why they felt different after leaving certain places. The ex-Satanist claimed spiritually undiscerning believers often carried atmospheres home with them, stress from work entering the family, fear from public spaces entering the mind, confusion from toxic environments entering relationships. The contamination spread. But then he described believers who disrupted this cycle completely. Before entering buildings, they prayed, and after leaving, they prayed again. That shocked listeners, because these believers understood something deeper. Not every atmosphere deserves access to your inner world. That sentence is critical. You are not called to absorb every environment you encounter. You are called to guard your spirit. The Satanist explained that spiritually mature believers often refuse to emotionally merge with hostile atmospheres. Chaos around them did not become chaos inside them, and that frustrated occult systems enormously because darkness depends heavily on internal agreement. Fear must be accepted, temptation must be entertained, confusion must be embraced. But spiritually prepared believers resisted internal synchronization with darkness. Then the ex-Satanist told a story he claimed haunted many former occult workers. A Christian nurse worked in a hospital environment filled with death, fear, grief, and emotional torment. Many workers became emotionally numb over time. Others collapsed mentally. But this nurse remained spiritually strong year after year, not because she ignored pain, because she guarded her spirit intentionally. Before every shift, she sat inside her car for a few moments and prayed. Before entering the building, every single day. The ex-Satanist said occult practitioners connected to spiritual oppression in that region became deeply frustrated by her presence. Patients calmed near her. Fear weakened around her. Hopeless individuals felt comforted after conversations with her. And according to the testimony, attempts to emotionally break her repeatedly failed. She carried another atmosphere into the building, he said. That revelation is powerful, because many believers think environments always shape them. But spiritually aligned believers can shape environments too. Light was never designed to fear darkness. Light was designed to confront it. The ex-Satanist then exposed one of the enemy's most subtle strategies: distraction before entry, phone scrolling, mental rushing, emotional chaos. Why? Because distracted people stop discerning spiritual shifts. They enter spaces mentally open and spiritually passive. And passive believers become easier to influence. That is why moments before entering a building matter more than many people realize. Your focus matters. Your inner condition matters. Your spiritual awareness matters. The ex-Satanists describe spiritually disciplined Christians almost like trained soldiers, not paranoid, prepared. They understood that every environment carried influence, and they chose intentionally what they would permit into their minds and spirits. Then he revealed another secret. Some believers unknowingly cancelled, attacked simply through consistent spiritual habits. Consistency, not occasional emotional prayers during emergencies, daily awareness, daily surrender, daily preparation, because consistent spiritual discipline creates stability under pressure. And stable believers are harder to manipulate emotionally. The ex-Satanist admitted that occult systems preferred impulsive Christians, Christians driven entirely by emotions, Christians lacking discernment, Christians who entered every environment, spiritually careless. But believers who developed disciplined spiritual habits became increasingly resistant to manipulation. Then he gave one final warning that felt almost prophetic. The battle often begins before the door opens. That sentence should stay in your mind. Because spiritual warfare is not always dramatic manifestations. Sometimes it is subtle pressure trying to shape your inner state before you step into critical environments. And if darkness can control your condition before entry, it often influences what happens after entry. That is why spiritually mature believers prepare before crossing thresholds. Not because they are afraid, because they understand authority. The ex-Satanist ended this revelation with chilling honesty. We could not easily touch believers who entered places already surrendered to God. Already surrendered. Not surrendering during crisis. Not searching for peace after damage happened. Already covered before the battle began. And maybe that is the revelation many believers desperately needed to hear. Because your greatest spiritual victories may begin long before anyone else notices the fight has started. The ex-Satanist took a deep breath before revealing the final secret. And what he said next felt less like information and more like a warning. The Christians we feared most were not always the loudest. They were the most spiritually disciplined. That statement shattered many assumptions, because people often imagine spiritual authority as noise. But according to his testimony, true authority was recognized in consistency, consistent prayer, consistent awareness, consistent surrender before entering environments. These believers did not wait for emergencies to seek God. They carried preparation into ordinary moments, and darkness noticed. The ex-Satanist explained that occult practitioners studied behavioral patterns carefully, not just actions, patterns. Who reacted emotionally under pressure? Who entered buildings angry? Who carried fear into meetings? Who walked distracted into vulnerable environments? Patterns revealed spiritual weaknesses. And according to him, many believers unknowingly repeated habits that left them exposed daily. Rushing everywhere, ignoring discernment, entering atmospheres emotionally unstable, then wondering why exhaustion, confusion, temptation, and heaviness kept increasing. But the believers who intentionally covered themselves before entering places became increasingly difficult to influence, because spiritual preparation creates internal resistance. Then he revealed something deeply disturbing. There were attacks designed to wait quietly inside environments, not immediate chaos, subtle influence. The goal was often gradual corruption, slow discouragement, slow compromise, slow emotional erosion. Because darkness understands that many people do not collapse instantly. They weaken gradually. Peace fades gradually. Discipline fades gradually. Discernment fades gradually. And eventually believers stop noticing how far they drifted. That is why awareness before entering environments matters so much. The ex-Satanist describes spiritually alert Christians almost like people carrying invisible boundaries around their minds and spirits. Not isolation, protection. They entered spaces prayerfully. They guarded their thoughts carefully. They resisted atmospheres trying to reshape them. And occult practitioners reportedly became frustrated because these believers refused internal agreement with darkness. Then he shared one final testimony that left many listeners shaken. A Christian teacher worked inside an environment filled with hostility toward faith, constant pressure, mockery, emotional tension. Several co-workers eventually broke emotionally under the atmosphere. But this teacher remained unusually stable year after year. The ex-Satanist said observers connected to occult practices became obsessed with understanding why she could not be emotionally dismantled. Then they discovered her routine. Every morning before entering the building, she stood briefly outside the entrance and surrendered the entire day to God. Every day, without fail, not dramatic, not performative, disciplined. And according to the testimony, that consistency built spiritual resilience around her life. Pressure came, but it could not dominate her. Fear approached, but it could not root deeply. Temptation appeared, but it struggled to gain influence because she entered covered before the pressure began. The ex-Satanist then exposed one of darkness's greatest advantages against modern believers: spiritual forgetfulness. People remember passwords, appointments, schedules, but forget spiritual preparation, forget discernment, forget prayer before entering environments, forget awareness of what surrounds them. And darkness thrives where awareness disappears, because spiritually unconscious people rarely resist influence effectively. That is why moments before entering buildings matter more than most people realize. Those moments determine alignment. Will fear govern your atmosphere, or faith? Will chaos shape your reactions, or peace? Will distraction control your focus, or spiritual awareness? The ex-Satanist said spiritually mature believers treated entrances like checkpoints, not rituals. checkpoints, moments to realign their minds with God before stepping into environments carrying unknown pressures. That perspective changes everything. Because instead of entering emotionally exposed, you begin entering intentionally covered. And intentionality weakens many attacks before they fully develop. Then he revealed one final secret from occult strategy. We preferred believers who only became spiritual after damage happened. That sentence is devastating, because many people only pray seriously after chaos erupts, after temptation overwhelms them, after fear dominates them, after confusion controls them. But wisdom prepares before impact. Preparation is protection. And spiritually disciplined believers understand this deeply. The ex-Satanist admitted occult systems hated Christians who maintained daily spiritual awareness because those believers became harder to spiritually contaminate over time. Not untouchable by life's difficulties, but harder to corrupt internally. That distinction matters. Storms still came, pressure still appeared, but spiritually prepared believers carried stability inside unstable environments. Then the ex-Satanist said something that sounded almost defeated. It became difficult to tell where the building's atmosphere ended and their spiritual authority began. That revelation is powerful, because when believers consistently enter places surrendered to God, they stop merely absorbing environments. They begin affecting them. Peace enters rooms through them. Discernment enters conversations through them. Strength enters fearful environments through them. And darkness hates that, because spiritually awake believers interrupt cycles of fear, confusion, temptation, and manipulation. The ex-Satanist then issued a warning directly to Christians. Never underestimate ordinary spiritual discipline. Not everything is won through dramatic moments. Some victories come through daily habits, daily surrender, daily awareness, daily preparation before entering spaces where pressure waits silently. And maybe that is the secret many believers have overlooked. For years, the battle often begins before conversations start, before temptations appear, before environments attempt to shape you, which means preparation must begin before entry too. The ex-Satanist ended his final revelation with words that stunned the audience into silence. The believers we feared most were the ones who never walked into places alone, not physically alone, spiritually alone, because they entered covered, entered aware, entered surrendered to God before crossing every threshold. And according to his testimony, darkness recognized that immediately. Now you understand why spiritual preparation terrifies darkness. You were never created to walk blindly into hostile atmospheres. You carry authority. You carry discernment. You carry the presence of God into every doorway you cross. From this day forward, never enter another building uncovered again. Because when you step in surrendered, aware, and spiritually prepared, darkness already knows it cannot touch what God has covered.